Picture the heat of an ancient Roman afternoon, the air thick with anticipation as crowds press together in the forum. The scent of sweat and dust mixes with the murmurs of spectators, some eager, some uneasy, all gathered to witness justice served in its most public form. At the center of it all stands a condemned man, his fate sealed by the empire's harshest punishment, crucifixion. The wood of the cross looms behind him, a stark symbol of Rome's absolute power. Yet here's the twist that might surprise you: this brutal method, designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation, was almost never used on Roman citizens. Even at the height of the empire's cruelty, there was an unspoken line drawn in the sand. Slaves, rebels, and enemies of the state might face the cross, but a citizen. That was a different story entirely. So why did Rome, an empire notorious for its ruthless efficiency in dealing with dissent, show such restraint when it came to its own people? The answer lies in a fascinating web of law, culture, and symbolism that shaped Roman society. Citizenship wasn't just a legal status, it was a sacred bond, a privilege that came with protections even the most powerful emperors hesitated to violate. Crucifixion wasn't merely a death sentence, it was a message, a spectacle meant to strip its victims of dignity and warn others against defiance. But for citizens, there were other ways to enforce order, methods that preserved the illusion of Rome's benevolence while still maintaining control. This is the hidden logic we're about to unravel, a story of social hierarchy, unspoken taboos, and the delicate balance of fear and respect that held an empire together. What made crucifixion too extreme for citizens, even when they committed treason? How did Roman law draw the line between punishment and degradation? And what does this reveal about the deeper values of a civilization that shaped the modern world? The truth is more surprising than you might think, weaving together threads of politics, religion, and human psychology. By the end of this journey, you'll see ancient Rome in a whole new light, not just as a powerhouse of conquest, but as a society grappling with the same questions of justice and identity that still resonate today. So let's step into the past and uncover the secrets behind Rome's most feared punishment and why it was reserved only for those outside the fold. Crucifixion didn't originate with Rome. It was a borrowed horror refined into an art form. The practice likely entered Roman consciousness through contact with the Carthaginians, their fierce rivals across the Mediterranean. Carthage used crucifixion as a brutal display of power, and Rome, ever the pragmatic student of its enemies, adopted and amplified it. But where others might have seen mere cruelty, Rome recognized something far more valuable: psychological warfare. The cross became more than a method of execution. It was a billboard, a stark reminder of the consequences of defiance. The message was clear: a challenge Rome and you wouldn't just die, you'd die in agony, stripped of dignity, your suffering on display for all to see. Yet from the beginning, this punishment carried a silent asterisk. It wasn't meant for everyone. In Rome's rigid social hierarchy, crucifixion was reserved primarily for slaves, rebels, and foreigners, those deemed outside the bounds of civilized society. The very act was designed to dehumanize, to reinforce the divide between us and them. For slaves, crucifixion served as a grim deterrent against uprisings. For conquered peoples, it was a warning against resistance, but for Roman citizens, the unspoken rule held firm. Even the worst criminals among them could expect a swifter, less theatrical end. Beheading or exile might await a traitor, but never the slow, public unraveling of crucifixion. This distinction wasn't arbitrary. it was woven into the fabric of Roman identity. Citizenship carried sacred weight, a legacy of Rome's early republic where rights and protections were hard-won. To crucify a citizen would violate not just law, but a deeper cultural taboo. It would signal that Rome's promise, the idea that citizenship meant something, was hollow. Emperors might bend the rules, but even they hesitated to break this one. The cross was for those who'd never belonged, a final reminder of their place in the empire's shadow. So how did Rome justify this divide? The answer lies in the delicate dance of power and perception. By sparing citizens the worst of its wrath, Rome maintained the illusion of fairness, a society where loyalty had its rewards. But beneath the surface, the message was just as calculated. The exemption wasn't kindness, it was control. By drawing this line, Rome reinforced the very hierarchy that kept it stable. And in doing so, it revealed a truth far more chilling than any execution. Some lives were meant to be disposable, while others were shielded by the invisible armor of privilege. The cross wasn't just a punishment, it was a mirror, reflecting who Rome believed was worthy of mercy and who wasn't. To understand why crucifixion was off-limits for citizens, we need to grasp just how precious Roman citizenship truly was. Unlike modern nations where birthright citizenship is common, in ancient Rome, this status was rare, fiercely guarded, and dripping with privilege. Imagine a world where simply being born within Rome's borders didn't automatically make you Roman, where your legal identity could mean the difference between protection and peril. Citizenship wasn't just paperwork, it was a golden ticket, a shield against the empire's darkest impulses. For those who held it, the benefits were profound. A Roman citizen couldn't be subjected to torture during interrogations, a right that would shock most non-citizens, for whom brutality was routine. They had the right to a formal trial, the opportunity to appeal directly to the emperor, and perhaps most strikingly, exemption from crucifixion itself. Even when sentenced to death, citizens were granted quicker, less humiliating methods, beheading by sword, for example, which was seen as a swift and honorable end. These weren't just legal technicalities, they were markers of humanity in Rome's eyes. But how did one become a citizen? Birth was the most straightforward path. If both your parents were citizens, so were you. Yet Rome also rewarded loyalty. Soldiers who completed 25 years of military service might receive citizenship as their pension. Entire cities could earn collective citizenship for their support during wars. Even freed slaves, though starting at society's lowest rung, could sometimes gain limited citizenship, weaving themselves into Rome's social fabric. This system wasn't just about fairness, it was brilliant politics. By dangling citizenship as a reward, Rome turned ambition into allegiance, giving outsiders a reason to strive for inclusion rather than rebellion. The contrast with non-citizens couldn't have been starker. Foreigners, slaves, and conquered peoples existed in a legal gray zone, vulnerable to punishment citizens would never face. A citizen convicted of murder might face exile, unpleasant but survivable. A non-citizen, crucifixion was a real possibility. This divide wasn't accidental, it was the glue holding Rome's empire together. By making citizenship so desirable, Rome ensured that even its subjects who lacked it still played by the rules, hoping one day to join the privileged class. This hierarchy extended beyond the courtroom into everyday life. Citizens wore their status like armor, from the cut of their togas to the way they walked through city streets. To strip a citizen of these protections, especially through something as degrading as crucifixion, would undermine the very system Rome relied on to govern millions. It would send a dangerous message that citizenship wasn't sacred, that Rome's promises could be broken. Even emperors known for their cruelty, figures like Nero or Caligula, generally respected this line not out of kindness, but because the stability of the empire depended on it. Yet here's the twist: Rome's restraint wasn't just about preserving order. It reflected a deeper, almost paradoxical belief that even in an empire built on conquest, some lines shouldn't be crossed. The same society that crucified thousands also clung to the idea that certain rights were inviolable, at least for those it deemed worthy. This duality, brutality tempered by tradition, shaped everything from law to warfare, revealing a civilization far more complex than its reputation for sheer violence suggests. What began as a simple legal distinction became a defining feature of Roman identity, one that echoes in modern debates about justice, belonging, and who deserves protection under the law. At the heart of Rome's restraint toward its citizens lay a powerful legal safeguard known as provocatio, a right so fundamental it acted like an emergency brake against the empire's own brutality. Picture this: a Roman citizen accused of a capital crime standing before a magistrate. Even as the sentence loomed, those two magic words, provoco ad populum, could halt the proceedings. This wasn't just courtroom drama. It was a centuries-old principle, a vestige of Rome's republican past that survived into the imperial era. Provocatio granted citizens the right to appeal death sentences directly to the People's Assembly, transforming a lone defendant's fate into a public debate. In theory, this meant no citizen could be executed without due process, a stark contrast to the summary justice meted out to slaves and foreigners. But provocatio wasn't just about fairness, it was a masterstroke of political theater. By preserving this ritual, Rome reinforced the myth that citizens had a voice, even under emperors who ruled with near absolute power. The reality: appeals rarely overturned sentences, especially in cases of treason. Yet the symbolism mattered. The mere existence of provocatio created an invisible barrier against crucifixion, ensuring citizens faced quicker, cleaner executions if they had to die at all. Beheading by sword, for instance, was considered dignified, a warrior's death far removed from the prolonged agony of the cross. This distinction wasn't accidental. Rome understood that how it killed mattered as much as who it killed. Of course, no system is without its cracks. Even provocatio had its limits, especially when the stability of the empire hung in the balance. Take the infamous case of Gaius Rabirius, a senator dragged through a treason trial in the 1st century BCE. His accusers, seeking to make an example of him, revived an archaic form of execution hanging from a barren tree that echoed crucifixion's humiliation without technically crossing the line. Then there were emperors like Caligula, who reportedly toyed with crucifying uppity citizens before advisors hastily reminded him of tradition. These near exceptions reveal the tension at Rome's core. The law was a shield, but power could bend it, just not quite break it. Why such reluctance to cross this final threshold? The answer lies in Rome's carefully cultivated self-image. Crucifying a citizen wouldn't just kill a man, it would unravel the social contract. For an empire built on conquest, maintaining the illusion of civic virtue was crucial. Slaves and rebels could be crucified because they existed outside Rome's moral universe. Their suffering served as a warning. But citizens, their punishment had to preserve the fiction of justice, even when it was anything but. This duality, savagery toward outsiders, restraint toward insiders, wasn't hypocrisy. It was strategy. Rome ruled through division, and crucifixion was its starkest line in the sand. What's truly revealing, though, are the rare moments when that line blurred. During the Spartacus revolt, some captured Roman soldiers were crucified by their own commanders, a shocking breach of protocol justified as wartime necessity. Even then, historians note these executions were discreet, away from public gaze, as if Rome couldn't bear to fully confront its own transgression. These exceptions prove the rule. Citizenship wasn't just a legal status, it was a psychological boundary even the most ruthless leaders hesitated to violate. Because once you admit that some citizens are expendable, you invite the question, who's next? This delicate dance between law and power raises deeper questions about Rome's legacy. How much of its restraint was principle, and how much was PR? The answer lies somewhere in between. Provocatio and similar protections weren't mere window dressing. They reflected genuine cultural values about dignity and belonging. Yet they also served a darker purpose, to make inequality seem natural, even righteous. By sparing citizens the cross, Rome didn't just protect them, it reminded everyone else why they should crave citizenship in the first place. The real genius wasn't in the mercy shown, but in the message sent. Some bodies were meant to suffer visibly, while others vanished quietly into the night, their privileges intact even in death. Now consider what this reveals about punishment as political theater. Rome's avoidance of citizen crucifixion wasn't kindness, it was crowd control. Every time a slave died on a cross while a citizen met a quicker end, the empire reinforced its hierarchy without saying a word. The law provided cover, but the spectacle did the real work. And in that tension between justice and cruelty, between privilege and pain, we see the blueprint for how societies, ancient and modern, decide who deserves protection and who deserves the cross. Crucifixion wasn't just about ending a life, it was about erasing a person's humanity in full view of the crowd. Think of the Roman public square as a stage, where every execution was a carefully choreographed performance. The condemned weren't merely killed, they were transformed into warnings, their broken bodies serving as living billboards about the cost of defiance. For slaves and rebels, the cross was the ultimate demotion, a brutal declaration that they'd forfeited any claim to dignity. But for citizens, the stakes were different. Rome's entire social order relied on the unshakable idea that some people were simply worth more than others. To crucify a citizen wouldn't just punish an individual, it would crack the foundation of that hierarchy, suggesting even the privileged weren't safe from degradation. This wasn't just about mercy, it was about maintaining a spectacle of power. When a slave died on the cross, the message was clear: this is what happens to those who forget their place. The violence was public because invisibility would have robbed it of its purpose. Crowds gathered not just to gawk, but to internalize the lesson. The writhing victim, the smell of sweat and blood, the cries that faded into whimpers, all of it reinforced the divide between those who belonged and those who didn't. Yet if a citizen were subjected to the same fate, the spectacle would backfire. Instead of reinforcing order, it would sow doubt. If a citizen could be stripped naked and left to rot like a common thief, what did that say about the value of citizenship itself? Rome's genius lay in its understanding of symbolic violence. The empire didn't just rule through force, it ruled through narrative. Every punishment told a story, and crucifixion's story was one of absolute otherness. Slaves and foreigners were cast as threats to civilization, their deaths a necessary purification. Citizens, by contrast, were the protagonists of Rome's grand saga, flawed perhaps but never irredeemable. Even when they committed treason, their executions were sanitized, almost respectful. A quick sword stroke in a private prison, a discreet dose of poison. These methods preserved the fiction that citizens were fundamentally different, even in death. The taboo against citizen crucifixion reveals a paradox at Rome's core. This was a society capable of staggering cruelty, yet obsessed with maintaining certain illusions. The same empire that crucified thousands could also cling to the idea that some lives, even those of criminals, deserved a semblance of honor. It wasn't compassion, it was calculated theater. By sparing citizens the cross, Rome didn't just protect them, it protected the very idea of Roman superiority. The lesson wasn't lost on observers. Every time a slave's body hung on the roadside while a disgraced senator died behind closed doors, the hierarchy was reaffirmed without a word spoken. So what did this mean for other execution methods? If crucifixion was reserved for the other, how did Rome deal with citizens who crossed the line? The answer lies in a quieter, but no less deliberate, array of punishments designed to balance justice with social preservation. Exile, for instance, allowed troublesome citizens to vanish without the messiness of public suffering. Beheading, while lethal, carried a martial dignity fitting for a society that worshipped military virtue. Even the gruesome fate of being sewn into a sack with live animals, a punishment for parricides, had a perverse logic. It was horrific, yes, but it happened out of sight, sparing the public the spectacle of a citizen's total debasement. This careful calibration of violence raises a haunting question. Was Rome's restraint toward citizens a sign of enlightenment, or just another form of control? The line between the two is razor thin. By treating citizens differently, Rome didn't just uphold their rights, it made citizenship a prize worth fighting for, worth obeying for. The cross wasn't avoided out of kindness, but because its power depended on exclusivity. Like a magician's trick, the spectacle only worked if the audience believed some were immune. And in that belief, Rome found its most potent tool, not the fear of death, but the terror of losing what made death meaningful. Roman citizens who faced execution were granted a grim but telling privilege. Their deaths, while still brutal, carried a veneer of dignity absent from crucifixion's spectacle. Take beheading, the most common alternative for disgraced elites. When Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, fell afoul of political rivals, his end came swiftly by sword, a death mirroring military executions, almost ritualistic in its efficiency. No public stripping, no lingering agony. His severed head and hands were displayed as a warning, yes, but the act itself was clinical, preserving a shred of the status he'd once held. This distinction wasn't accidental. Beheading acknowledged the condemned's humanity, even in punishment. The blade's quick strike implied a debt paid, not a soul destroyed. Exile, another favored tool, served as Rome's quiet eraser. For citizens whose crimes weren't treasonous enough to demand blood, philosophers who questioned imperial authority, or politicians who'd simply backed the wrong faction, banishment offered a bloodless solution. Ovid's fate exemplifies this. After angering Emperor Augustus, the poet wasn't dragged to a cross but shipped to Tomis, a remote Black Sea outpost, his punishment. Not pain but irrelevance, a living death far from Rome's glittering center. Exile achieved two goals at once. It neutralized threats without martyrdom, while broadcasting that even mild dissent carried consequences. Compare these methods to crucifixion's visceral horror. Where beheading and exile maintained a facade of order, the cross was chaos weaponized. Victims weren't just killed, they were unraveled, stripped naked, their bodies contorted, their final hours a theater of suffering designed to break the spirit before the body. For citizens, such degradation risked unsettling the very crowds Rome sought to control. A crucified slave reinforced hierarchy. A crucified senator might spark uncomfortable questions about who truly held power. The political calculus behind these choices becomes stark in cases like Sejanus, Emperor Tiberius's once trusted advisor. After his fall, Sejanus was strangled in prison, his body thrown to a mob that tore it apart, a frenzy of violence, yet notably not crucifixion. Even in moments of extreme vengeance, Rome hesitated to fully dehumanize its own. The message was clear: citizens could be destroyed, but never debased like common rebels. This carefully tiered system of punishment reveals Rome's deeper strategy. By reserving crucifixion for outsiders, the empire turned legal distinctions into psychological barriers. A citizen might fear execution, but not the total annihilation of self that the cross represented. That unspoken guarantee that some lines wouldn't be crossed, even for the condemned, made citizenship a prize worth preserving at all costs. And in that gap between the sword and the nail, Rome wielded its most potent tool, the illusion that some lives, even in death, still mattered. Consider the sheer scale of Spartacus' revolt, a slave uprising that shook Rome to its core. In 73 BC, this gladiator Revolt turned thousands of enslaved people into an army that humiliated Roman legions for 2 years. When the rebellion was finally crushed, the response wasn't just punishment, it was a statement. Along the Appian Way, 6,000 crosses stretched for miles, each bearing a rebel's broken body. This wasn't just about eliminating threats, it was a masterclass in psychological dominance. Every traveler who passed that road absorbed the lesson: challenge Rome, and this is your fate. Yet noticeably absent from that gruesome gallery, Roman citizens. Even in its most desperate hour, the empire clung to its unspoken rule: crucifixion was for outsiders, a boundary that preserved the myth of internal solidarity. The cross functioned as Rome's ultimate propaganda tool, a brutal shorthand for who mattered and who didn't. Rebellious slaves like Spartacus' followers weren't just criminals, they were symbols of chaos, embodiments of Rome's deepest fears about social upheaval. By crucifying them en masse, the empire performed a dark alchemy, transforming human suffering into a stabilizing force. The message wasn't subtle. These lives were expendable because they existed to define what Romans were not. Contrast this with how Rome handled citizen dissent. When the populist politician Catiline conspired against the state in 63 BC, his execution was swift: strangulation in the Tullianum prison, a grim but discreet end. The difference in treatment wasn't about mercy, it was about narrative control. Slaves died screaming in public to terrify the masses. Citizens vanished quietly to avoid uncomfortable questions. This duality reveals crucifixion's true purpose. It wasn't merely a punishment, but a citizenship test in reverse. The very act of nailing someone to wood declared them alien to Rome's body politic. Historians note that even foreign kings captured in war, like the Gallic leader Vercingetorix, were spared the cross, strangled in prison instead because their status granted them a shred of dignity. But slaves, rebels, their deaths had to be spectacularly undignified to reinforce the social order. The cross was Rome's way of saying some people could never belong, no matter how brave or skilled. Spartacus' fate proved that even genius and courage couldn't erase the stain of servitude in Roman eyes. Yet there's a chilling irony here. Rome's reluctance to crucify citizens didn't stem from kindness, but from the recognition that some spectacles could backfire. Imagine if the thousands who witnessed Spartacus' followers dying had also seen Roman citizens sharing their fate. The carefully crafted illusion of privilege, the idea that loyalty guaranteed protection, would shatter. By keeping crucifixion's horrors at arm's length from citizens, Rome made its hierarchy feel inevitable, even natural. The slave on the cross and the citizen with a sword at their throat weren't just experiencing different punishments, they were playing different roles in Rome's theater of power. One death screamed warning, the other whispered complicity. This calculated violence had lasting echoes. Centuries later, when Rome crucified Jesus of Nazareth, the choice of method wasn't random. As a provincial outsider preaching radical ideas, his execution followed the established script: public, prolonged, and humiliating. The fact that early Christians would later reclaim the cross as a symbol of hope only underscores its original power as an instrument of terror. Rome understood what modern regimes still grasp: how you kill can be as politically charged as why you kill. The cross wasn't just wood and nails, it was a loaded metaphor, a way to codify who deserved pain and who deserved process. What's often overlooked is how this system manipulated not just the condemned but the spectators. When crowds gathered to watch slaves die, they weren't just witnessing justice, they were rehearsing their own allegiance. Every cry from the cross reinforced the viewer's subconscious relief: that could never be me. This psychological divide, more than any law, sustained Rome's empire. By making crucifixion unthinkable for citizens, Rome turned privilege into a psychological cage, one where the fear of losing status ensured obedience more effectively than chains ever could. The real masterpiece wasn't the cruelty itself, but the way it made mercy feel like a gift rather than a right. Now, shift perspective for a moment. Imagine being a Roman citizen walking past those 6,000 crosses after Spartacus' defeat. The smell, the sounds, the sheer scale of suffering, all designed to make you feel both repulsed and reassured. That cognitive dissonance was the empire's secret weapon. You might pity the victims, but you'd also internalize the lesson: step out of line, and the distance between you and them could vanish. This wasn't just fear-mongering, it was identity engineering. Rome's genius lay in making its violence selective enough to feel purposeful, yet random enough to keep everyone uneasy. The cross stood as a grisly reminder that safety was conditional, and citizenship, however sacred, was never truly a guarantee, just the best available shield against a system that always hungered for fresh examples. Rome understood something profound about human nature: fear works best when it's selective. The cross wasn't just a tool for punishing rebels, it was a psychological lever, carefully calibrated to divide society into those who felt protected and those who knew they weren't. Picture a Roman citizen walking through the Forum, passing a row of crucified slaves. The sight would trigger two conflicting emotions: relief that this could never happen to them, and a quiet dread that their safety hinged on staying in Rome's good graces. This duality was the empire's real innovation. By making crucifixion unthinkable for citizens, Rome turned privilege into a form of control. The message wasn't just obey or die, it was obey, and you'll never die like that. The genius of this system lay in its asymmetry. Slaves and foreigners lived with a constant, visceral awareness of what awaited descent. Every public crucifixion was a reminder that their bodies were disposable, their suffering a spectacle. But citizens, they existed in a carefully maintained bubble of legal fiction. Even when they broke the law, their punishments carried an unspoken acknowledgement of their humanity. This wasn't kindness, it was incentive. By sparing citizens the worst horrors, Rome gave them a stake in the system. Why rebel when you had something to lose? The empire's stability relied on this calculated inequality, this illusion that some people were worthier of mercy. Religion and superstition deepened this divide. Roman law might have drawn the line between citizen and non-citizen, but it was the gods who sanctified it. Executions weren't just legal acts, they were rituals steeped in symbolism. Crucifixion, with its prolonged agony, was seen as a form of pollution, a degradation so severe it risked offending the divine order. Citizens, as bearers of Rome's sacred identity, couldn't be subjected to that spiritual contamination. Their quicker, cleaner executions preserved the illusion that their souls remained intact, even if their lives were forfeit. Meanwhile, the very brutality reserved for outsiders reinforced their status as impure, their deaths a necessary purge of chaos from the world. This hierarchy bled into everyday life. A slave knew their master could have them crucified for disobedience, but also that a citizen neighbor might intervene, not out of compassion, but because the law allowed it. This created a web of dependencies where the privileged policed the powerless and everyone stayed in their assigned role. Even the language reflected this divide. The Latin word supplicium, often used for crucifixion, carried connotations of humiliation and debasement, a fate beneath a citizen's dignity. By contrast, a citizen's execution was termed pona, a word closer to penalty or justice, implying proportionality rather than annihilation. The psychological impact rippled outward. Conquered peoples watching Rome spare its own citizens from the cross internalized a brutal lesson. Integration was possible, but only on Rome's terms. Fight the empire and you die in agony. Submit, adopt its customs, and maybe, just maybe, your descendants would earn the right to a quicker, cleaner death. This wasn't just fear-mongering, it was a recruitment strategy. Rome's greatest trick was making oppression feel like opportunity, convincing the oppressed that the path to safety lay in becoming the oppressor. Yet the system's fragility lurked beneath the surface. What happened when citizens did face extremes, like during proscriptions or civil wars? The answer reveals the limits of Rome's psychological engineering. In crises, the rules bent, but they rarely broke. Even when citizens were executed en masse, methods like beheading or drowning prevailed, preserving the taboo against crucifixion. The empire's resilience hinged on this consistency. By holding the line even in chaos, Rome ensured that when order returned, the hierarchy snapped back into place. The cross remained the ultimate boundary, a line so stark that crossing it would unravel the very fabric of Roman identity. Now consider how superstition reinforced this order. Roman religion taught that the gods favored the state, so how could a punishment pleasing to the gods be wrong? But crucifixion's horror created a paradox. If the gods willed it for outsiders, why forbid it for citizens? The answer lay in Rome's concept of piety, the idea that some acts, while necessary, were too unclean for the body politic. Citizens could wage wars, suppress rebellions, and profit from slavery, but their hands had to appear clean. The cross, with its visceral degradation, was the line even empire couldn't cross without tainting itself. In this way, religion didn't just justify violence, it laundered it, turning state terror into divine will while keeping Rome's self-image spotless. This intricate dance of fear and favor left its mark on history. Long after Rome fell, other empires would borrow its playbook, using selective brutality to divide and rule, but none matched Rome's psychological precision. The cross wasn't merely a punishment, it was a mirror reflecting who society valued and who it discarded. And in that reflection, we see the unsettling truth. The most effective systems of control don't just threaten, they tempt. They dangle the promise of safety, whispering that cruelty is what happens to other people, until one day it isn't. In Rome's worldview, the human body wasn't just flesh and bone, it was a sacred vessel, a temporary home for the soul on its journey to the afterlife. This belief transformed execution methods into more than just punishments. They became rituals with cosmic consequences. Crucifixion, with its prolonged exposure and deliberate mutilation of the body, violated a fundamental Roman taboo, the idea that a corpse deserved respect to ensure peaceful passage to the underworld. For citizens, this wasn't just about pain, it was about spiritual pollution. To leave a citizen's body rotting in public wasn't just cruel, it risked angering the gods by sending a tormented soul wandering as a restless spirit. The same empire that nailed rebels to crosses would hesitate to subject its own people to a fate believed to invite divine retribution. This distinction between citizen and outsider extended beyond death. Roman funerary rites for citizens were elaborate affairs, processions, eulogies, even masks of ancestors carried by mourners. A proper burial ensured the deceased joined the manes, the revered spirits of the departed who watched over the family. But for the crucified, their bodies were often left to scavengers, denied even basic rights. The message was stark: some souls mattered to the gods and some didn't. This duality wasn't hypocrisy, it was theology in service of power. By reserving crucifixion for those outside the civic religious order, Rome reinforced the idea that citizenship wasn't just a legal status, it was a spiritual privilege. The fear of pollution haunted Roman execution practices. Myths warned of cities struck by plagues after improper burials, or battles lost because a general ignored omens. When the rebel slave Spartacus was finally defeated, his body was never displayed lightly because even in victory, Rome feared the unrest of an unquiet spirit. Contrast this with the fate of thousands of his followers, left to decay on crosses along the Appian Way. Their souls, in Roman eyes, were already forfeit, their suffering a purification of the state rather than a risk to it. The calculus was cold but clear. The gods cared how citizens died but turned away from the screams of slaves. Yet even these taboos had their limits. As Rome's empire expanded, absorbing new cultures and gods, old certainties began to fray. The rise of mystery cults, like those of Isis or Mithras, introduced competing ideas about the afterlife, some promising salvation even to the lowliest. Christianity's eventual embrace of the cross as a symbol of victory would have baffled early Romans, for whom it represented ultimate shame. This shift hints at a deeper tension. No system of belief, no matter how deeply rooted, can forever justify why some lives are shielded from suffering while others are sacrificed to maintain order. The question lingers: how much of Rome's restraint was genuine piety, and how much was political theater wrapped in religious trappings? The answer lies in the empire's pragmatism. By linking citizenship to divine favor, Rome made inequality seem ordained rather than arbitrary. The gods themselves, it seemed, had drawn the line between those worthy of dignity and those fit only for the cross. This wasn't just law, it was mythology weaponized, a story so potent it endured long after the last crucifixion faded from history. And in that story, we see the dark power of belief, not just to comfort, but to justify the unthinkable. Rome's execution methods weren't set in stone. They evolved alongside the empire itself, mirroring its political turbulence and shifting identity. In the early Republic, punishments were stark but relatively restrained, reflecting a smaller city-state's values. The death penalty existed, but it often took the form of hurling traitors from the Tarpeian Rock, a quick, symbolic defenestration that echoed Rome's austere origins. Yet as the Republic expanded, so did its appetite for spectacle. By the time of the Punic Wars, crucifixion emerged as Rome's signature tool for suppressing rebellion, its brutality scaling with the empire's growing paranoia about internal threats. The Second Punic War saw mass crucifixions of rebellious allies, setting a grim precedent. The larger Rome grew, the more it relied on terror to hold its territories together. The transition from republic to empire marked a subtle but significant shift. Under Augustus, crucifixions became more calculated, less about raw vengeance, more about messaging. Rebellious slaves still faced the cross, but now their executions were staged near major roads or city gates, turning suffering into a geographic warning. Citizens, meanwhile, saw their privileges erode slowly. While the formal ban on crucifying them held, the rise of imperial power meant fewer checks on executions altogether. The infamous Emperor Caligula allegedly toyed with crucifying a citizen before backing down, not out of legal scruples, but because his advisors warned of the backlash. This tension revealed the system's fragility. Tradition alone now shielded citizens, not laws. By the late Empire, crucifixion's decline began, not because Rome grew kinder, but because its identity had transformed. As citizenship expanded granted to nearly all free inhabitants by Caracalla in 212 CE, the old distinctions blurred. If everyone was a citizen, the cross lost its symbolic power. New methods like burning at the stake or exposure to beasts gained favor, offering fresh horrors for a desensitized populace. Even Constantine's eventual ban on crucifixion in the 4th century wasn't purely humanitarian. It reflected Christianity's rise and the cross's repurposing as a sacred symbol rather than a tool of terror. What's revealing is how these changes mirrored Rome's existential struggles. In its insecure, expansionist youth, crucifixion served as a brutal assertion of dominance. At its imperial height, the method became a controlled performance of power, and in its twilight, as Rome grappled with identity crises, the cross faded not from compassion, but because its utility as a social divider had expired. The empire's execution methods were never just about justice. They were barometers of its deepest anxieties, evolving to meet the needs of the moment. This legacy didn't vanish with Rome. Medieval kingdoms revived crucifixion during peasant revolts, recognizing its psychological potency. Even modern dictatorships have echoed its logic, reserving certain horrors for outsiders while maintaining gentler facades for their own. Rome's true innovation wasn't the cross itself, but the understanding that terror works best when it's selective, when the audience believes they're exempt. That chilling insight, more than any execution method, became the empire's most enduring export. Rome's approach to crucifixion stands in stark contrast to the practices of other ancient empires, each with their own brutal traditions, but none with Rome's peculiar mix of legalism and spectacle. Take Persia, where crucifixion was wielded as a blunt instrument of terror. When King Darius the Great crushed a rebellion in Babylon, he crucified 3,000 nobles at once, a sweeping display of power meant to shock entire regions into submission. There was no nuance here, no distinction between citizen and rebel, only raw intimidation. Greece, too, showed little restraint. Alexander the Great crucified 2,000 survivors after the siege of Tyre, their bodies lining the coast as a warning to any city daring to resist. Unlike Rome, these empires didn't bother with legal niceties. Crucifixion was a tool of conquest, not a carefully measured punishment. Carthage, Rome's greatest rival, offers the most revealing comparison. The Carthaginians didn't just crucify enemies, they crucified their own generals for failure in battle. Imagine the psychological toll. Commanders who lost wars knew they'd face not just death, but the ultimate humiliation at the hands of their own people. Rome, by contrast, reserved such horrors exclusively for outsiders, preserving a veneer of civility for its citizens. This wasn't just a difference in cruelty, it was a difference in philosophy. Where Carthage used crucifixion to enforce accountability, Rome used it to enforce hierarchy. What set Rome apart wasn't its capacity for violence, but its precision in applying it. Persian and Greek crucifixions were spectacles of indiscriminate rage, while Rome's were coldly theatrical, each one a calculated lesson about who mattered and who didn't. Even in its brutality, Rome clung to legalistic justifications, trials, decrees, the pretense of order. This duality raises a provocative question. Was Rome's system more sophisticated, or just better at disguising its hypocrisy? On one hand, the empire's restraint toward citizens reflected a genuine belief in the sanctity of civic bonds. On the other, it exposed the hollowness of those bonds, which shielded only the privileged while condemning others to the cross. The tension between these interpretations plays out in Rome's most infamous near-misses cases where citizens teetered on the edge of crucifixion, saved only by the thinnest threads of tradition. Take the scandal of the Bacchanalia in 1860 BC, when thousands of Romans were accused of treasonous cult activity. The Senate ordered executions, but crucifying citizens, even in mass hysteria, remained unthinkable. Instead, the condemned faced private strangulation, their death swift and unseen. Then there's the curious case of the pirate prisoners during Pompey's campaigns. When captured pirates begged for mercy, Pompey granted them quick beheadings, unlike the crucified rebels of Spartacus's army, whose suffering was prolonged for maximum visibility. These exceptions prove the rule. Rome's system wasn't just about who died, but how they died and who was watching. Other empires used crucifixion to erase enemies. Rome used it to define them. The cross wasn't merely a punishment, it was a cultural boundary, a way to codify who belonged to Rome's story and who existed outside it. And in that distinction, we see the empire's true innovation, the ability to make brutality feel like justice, so long as it was applied to the right people. But what happened when that line blurred, when citizens came perilously close to the fate reserved for slaves and rebels? The answer lies in the shadows of Rome's most turbulent moments, times when even the privileged weren't entirely safe. That's where our story turns next. Even in Rome's most ruthless eras, there were moments when the line between citizen and outsider blurred, when powerful figures came perilously close to facing the cross themselves. Take Gaius Verres, the notoriously corrupt governor of Sicily. In 70 BC, his trial exposed a reign of terror, temples looted, citizens tortured, even a Roman sailor crucified despite pleading his citizenship. The evidence was damning, the outrage universal, yet when conviction seemed certain, Verres didn't wait for sentencing. He fled into exile, sparing Rome an uncomfortable dilemma. Here was a man whose crimes mirrored those of rebellious provincials, yet crucifixion was never seriously considered. Why? Because Verres, for all his depravity, still wore the invisible armor of citizenship. His punishment, self-imposed banishment, upheld the fiction that some people were simply too connected to degrade. Then there were the senators caught in the Catiline conspiracy of 63 BC, a plot to overthrow the Republic. These weren't fringe players, they were elites, men who dined with Cicero himself. When evidence revealed their treason, the punishment debate split Rome. Some argued for crucifixion as a warning to other would-be traitors. Yet cooler heads prevailed, insisting citizens deserved a swifter end. The conspirators died by strangulation in the Tullianum prison, their bodies disposed of discreetly. This wasn't mercy, it was damage control. Crucifying senators would have exposed the fragility of Rome's social order, revealing that even the mighty could fall to the level of slaves. Better to let them vanish quietly, their privileges intact in death. These near misses reveal the unspoken tension at Rome's core. The empire's stability relied on the idea that citizenship was inviolable, yet power struggles constantly tested that principle. When the ruthless general Marius purged his enemies in 87 BC, some victims were thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, a brutal but respectable execution for citizens. When Emperor Nero sought to punish Christians after the Great Fire of 64 CE, even he stopped short of crucifying Roman converts, opting for burning or mauling by beasts instead. Each exception proved the rule. Crucifixion's horror wasn't just about pain, but about maintaining the illusion that some lives were sacred. The case of Publius Clodius Pulcher, the fiery populist who terrorized Rome's elite, illustrates how thin this line could be. After desecrating a religious rite a crime some considered treason, Clodius faced calls for crucifixion from his enemies. Yet the punishment was unthinkable. His patrician blood protected him even as he inflamed mobs against the establishment. Instead, he endured exile, returning later to wreak more havoc. Rome's restraint here wasn't weakness, it was strategy. By sparing Clodius the cross, the elite preserved their own immunity, ensuring no precedent would threaten them later. What's most revealing is how these exceptions unfolded. When citizens skirted crucifixion, it was rarely about their crimes, but about their connections. Theirs had allies in high places. The Catiline conspirators were old aristocracy, even under emperors like Tiberius, whose treason trials targeted senators. Executions stayed civilized, forced suicides with hemlock or opened veins. The message was clear: the higher you climbed, the softer your landing, even in disgrace. This double standard reached its peak under Caligula, whose reign tested every Roman taboo. The mad emperor reportedly ordered a citizen crucified for insulting him, only to rescind the command at the last moment. The reason? Advisors warned that breaking this taboo would alienate the very elites Caligula relied on. The incident became legend not because it happened, but because it almost did, a chilling reminder that citizenship's protections were only as strong as the emperor's self-control. These stories expose the fragility behind Rome's rigid hierarchy. The empire could tolerate corruption, even treason, from within its ranks, but it couldn't survive the symbolic collapse of crucifying its own. Every near miss reinforced the system by proving its flexibility. Elites might fall, but never so far as to join the ranks of those they ruled. In the end, Rome's greatest fiction wasn't that justice was blind, but that some were simply too important to see. The roar of the Roman crowd wasn't just background noise, it was a force that could bend the will of emperors. Public opinion, especially in the packed streets of the capital, held surprising sway over who lived, who died, and how they met their end. Take the case of a young noble named Gavius, wrongly condemned during Ver's corrupt rule in Sicily. When news reached Rome that a citizen had been crucified despite pleading his status, the outcry wasn't just moral outrage, it was political dynamite. Cicero, seizing the moment, turned Gavius' fate into a rallying cry, his speeches painting the cross as a symbol of tyranny encroaching on sacred rights. The public's fury became so intense that even the Senate, often indifferent to provincial abuses, couldn't ignore it. Verres fled before facing consequences, but the lesson was clear. Romans might tolerate brutality, but only when it stayed on the right side of the citizen-outside divide. This wasn't isolated. During the chaotic year of the four emperors in 69 CE, Vitellius faced riots after ordering the execution of a popular soldier accused of treason. The man's legionaries and the plebs mobbed the streets, not disputing his guilt but demanding the dignity of a swift death. Vitellius, desperate to avoid unrest, conceded swapping the cross for a sword stroke. These moments reveal a paradox. Rome's mob, often bloodthirsty at gladiatorial games, could become fiercely protective when the condemned wore the invisible cloak of citizenship. It wasn't compassion driving these protests, but self-interest. If the state could degrade one citizen who was next, the elite, too, played this game not out of solidarity, but survival. When wealthy Senator Publius Clodius was accused of sacrilege, his rivals clamored for crucifixion, knowing the mere suggestion would horrify the public. The resulting backlash forced a compromise: exile over execution, preserving the taboo. Even emperors tread carefully. Tiberius, no stranger to purges, ensured senatorial traitors died by suicide in their villas, a quiet nod to their status, while slaves' informants faced the cross. The double standard was nakedly political. Break the norms for elites, and you risked inspiring the very rebellions crucifixion was meant to deter. Yet Rome's enemies learned to weaponize these sensitivities. During the Jewish Revolt in 70 CE, rebel leaders executed Roman prisoners by crucifixion, a deliberate inversion of the empire's own tactics. The provocation was brilliant psychological warfare. By treating legionaries as Rome treated slaves, they exposed the fragility of imperial power. The message, citizenship, wasn't a shield if your enemy refused to play by the rules. Likewise, pirates in the eastern Mediterranean famously crucified captured Romans along coastlines, knowing the spectacle would rattle morale back home. These acts weren't just cruelty, they were calculated strikes at Rome's carefully constructed hierarchy, proving the empire's greatest weakness was its own mythology of exception. The mob's power had limits, of course. When Spartacus' rebellion was crushed, no amount of plebeian sympathy could spare 6,000 slaves from the cross. But the pattern held. Citizen solidarity worked only when the threatened were us, not them. This selective empathy shaped Rome's entire approach to justice. The crowd might cheer as foreign rebels writhed on crosses, then riot if a citizen baker faced the same fate. The inconsistency wasn't hypocrisy, it was the system working as designed. By making citizenship the line between spectacle and sanctity, Rome turned privilege into a collective delusion, one where the privileged would fight to preserve the very rules that kept others expendable. What's chilling is how these dynamics echo beyond antiquity. The same forces that spared Gavius the cross-public pressure, elite self-preservation, the fear of precedent, still influence justice today. Rome's genius was recognizing that terror must be selective to be sustainable. When the crowd believes their status protects them, they'll tolerate unimaginable violence against outsiders. But let that violence creep too close to home, and even the most brutal regimes face revolt. The cross, in the end, wasn't just a tool of control, it was a mirror, reflecting who society was willing to sacrifice and who it would fight to protect. To Rome's enemies, the empire's carefully curated system of justice wasn't just brutal, it was brazenly hypocritical. The historian Tacitus, writing from the perspective of conquered peoples, captured this bitterness perfectly. They create a desert and call it peace. The line cuts deep because it exposes the contradiction at Rome's core, a civilization that prided itself on law and order while reserving its worst horrors for those outside the fold. Rebellious tribes in Gaul, Jewish zealots in Judea, even disaffected allies in Greece all saw through the facade. To them, Rome's refusal to crucify its own citizens wasn't evidence of fairness, but proof of a double standard that exposed the hollowness of its so-called civilization. Consider the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, who surrendered to Julius Caesar only to be paraded through Rome's streets before a quiet strangulation in prison. To the Romans, this was mercy, a dignified end for a worthy adversary. But to the Gauls, it was a calculated insult. By sparing Vercingetorix the cross, Rome wasn't honoring him. It was reinforcing the idea that only those it deemed worthy of citizenship deserved a painless death. The message to rebellious provinces was clear. You could fight, you could even earn grudging respect, but you'd never truly belong. This selective cruelty became fuel for resistance. When the Britons under Boudicca revolted, they didn't just attack Roman forts, they targeted symbols of this hypocrisy, slaughtering officials who'd once boasted of their civilizing mission while crucifying dissidents. Jewish rebels during the Great Revolt of 66 CE took the critique further, turning Rome's methods against it. After capturing Roman soldiers, they crucified them along the walls of Jerusalem, not just as vengeance but as propaganda. Each nailed legionary was a rebuttal to Rome's claims of superiority, a visceral demonstration that the empire's vaunted justice was just violence in a toga. The historian Josephus, himself a conflicted observer, noted how these acts galvanized the rebellion. Where Rome saw crucifixion as a tool of order, its enemies framed it as evidence of tyranny, a sign that the empire ruled not by consent but by terror. Even Rome's allies grew disillusioned. Greek intellectuals who'd once admired Roman law began questioning its foundations when they saw how arbitrarily it was applied. The philosopher Dio Chrysostom mocked Rome's pretense of fairness, asking why a citizen thief might face exile while a slave who stole bread died screaming on a cross. This wasn't just philosophical nitpicking, it eroded the loyalty of subject peoples who'd once bought into Rome's promise of integration. Why strive for citizenship? They began to ask if the empire's mercy was just another form of control. The most damning critiques came from within Rome's own borders. Christian writers like Tertullian turned crucifixion's symbolism against the state, recasting it from a tool of terror to a symbol of martyrdom. By celebrating figures who died on crosses, they flipped Rome's narrative. What the empire meant to degrade, they exalted. This ideological jiu-jitsu unsettled the authorities far more than outright rebellion. When the Emperor Julian later tried to counter Christianity, he didn't just ban the faith, he banned crucifixion itself, recognizing its power as a rallying cry against Roman rule. These perceptions didn't just shape rebellions, they accelerated Rome's unraveling. As the empire expanded, granting citizenship to more and more peoples, the old distinctions that made crucifixion effective began to blur. If everyone was a citizen who was left to crucify, and if no one feared the cross, what would keep them in line? The answer, as Rome's later history shows, was nothing. The very selectivity that once reinforced its power became its Achilles heel, a system so reliant on dividing us from them that it couldn't survive when those divisions collapsed. In the end, Rome's downfall wasn't just caused by barbarian invasions or economic decay, but by the slow erosion of the myths that had sustained its justice. The cross, once a symbol of invincible might, became a relic of a dying order, proof that no empire can forever terrorize its way to peace. The tides of history began to turn against crucifixion, not through sudden enlightenment, but through a slow seismic shift in Rome's spiritual landscape. As Christianity spread from the empire's margins to its heart, the very symbol Rome had used to terrorize became sacred to millions. Early Christians didn't just worship a crucified man, they reclaimed the cross as a badge of honor, transforming an instrument of humiliation into a promise of salvation. This ideological revolution forced imperial hands. When Constantine converted in the early 4th century, his famous vision of the cross as a battlefield symbol wasn't just personal, it was political. The emperor, who once might have ordered crucifixions, now saw the cross through the eyes of his growing Christian constituency. By 315 CE, his Edict of Milan had already granted religious tolerance. Within decades, crucifixion would vanish from Roman law entirely. But Christianity wasn't the sole force eroding this ancient practice. Rome itself was changing. As citizenship expanded under emperors like Caracalla, who granted it to all free inhabitants in 212 CE, the old social hierarchies that made crucifixion meaningful began to crumble. If everyone was a citizen who remained to crucify, the empire's answer was grimly pragmatic. New methods like burning at the stake or exposure to beasts emerged, offering fresh horrors for a desensitized populace. Yet even these lacked crucifixion's psychological potency. Without the stark divide between citizen and outsider, executions lost their symbolic weight, becoming mere violence rather than political theater. Constantine's eventual ban on crucifixion in the mid-4th century wasn't purely spiritual, it was shrewd statecraft. By abolishing a practice now revered by Christians, he cemented his image as a moral reformer while subtly asserting imperial control over religious symbolism. The cross would no longer belong to executioners. It would adorn churches and banners, repurposed as a tool of unity rather than division. This wasn't kindness, it was rebranding. Rome's genius for spectacle endured, but its stagecraft had changed. Where once bodies hung on crosses to warn rebels, now processions of glittering relics proclaimed divine favor for the empire. Yet the echoes of crucifixion's terror lingered. Medieval kings would revive it during peasant revolts, recognizing its power to intimidate. Artists from Renaissance painters to modern filmmakers would obsess over its imagery, drawn to its visceral drama. Even today, the cross remains one of history's most potent symbols, not despite its brutality, but because of it. The next time you see a cross on a church steeple or a necklace, remember, you're witnessing the ultimate irony of empire. A tool designed to divide and terrify was reclaimed by the very people it was meant to suppress, turning Rome's darkest spectacle into a global symbol of hope. That transformation from instrument of death to emblem of life may be history's most astonishing rebellion. Hollywood has a way of sanding down history's rough edges, turning complex truths into simple spectacles. When films like Ben-Hur or Spartacus depict crucifixion, they often show it as Rome's go-to punishment for anyone who defied the empire: gladiators, rebels, even disgraced nobles. But this dramatic shorthand misses a crucial nuance. Crucifixion wasn't just about crime and punishment, it was about identity. The same movies that linger on the agony of the cross rarely pause to ask why Roman citizens almost never faced it, even when their crimes were far worse than those of the slaves dying beside them. This omission isn't just historical oversight, it's a distortion that flattens Rome's calculated cruelty into generic brutality, erasing the very selectivity that made the cross such a potent political tool. Art and literature have compounded this myth. Renaissance paintings of biblical scenes, for instance, often depict Jesus' crucifixion surrounded by a sea of crosses, as if mass executions were routine. In reality, Rome reserved such spectacles for moments of extreme crisis, like Spartacus' revolt. Even then, the victims were overwhelmingly slaves and foreigners, a detail lost in the grand brushstrokes of artists more focused on pathos than precision. The irony is striking. A punishment designed to dehumanize its victims has been romanticized over centuries. Its true function as a social divider softened into a universal symbol of suffering. The most persistent misconception centers on Jesus himself. His crucifixion was historically exceptional, not just for its spiritual significance, but because it blurred Rome's usual lines. As a non-citizen from a restive province, Jesus fit the profile of those typically crucified. Yet the Gospels hint at unease among Roman officials. Pilate's reluctance, the crown of thorns as a mocking nod to his alleged kingship. These details suggest even his executioners sensed the unusual stakes. Later Christian tradition would amplify this tension, portraying Jesus' death as both a Roman atrocity and a divine paradox. The moment the empire's ultimate weapon of shame was transformed into a symbol of triumph. Modern retellings often miss this duality. Films like The Passion of the Christ focus on visceral suffering while glossing over the political calculus behind it. Rarely do they explore why Rome hesitated to crucify citizens, or how Jesus' status as a provincial outsider made him vulnerable in ways a Roman apostle like Paul, who faced beheading, was not. This selective storytelling has consequences. It turns crucifixion into a vague emblem of ancient cruelty rather than what it truly was, a mirror reflecting who Rome valued and who it considered disposable. So what does this centuries-old distortion teach us? Perhaps that societies still grapple with the same questions Rome did. Who deserves dignity and who can be sacrificed to maintain order? When we uncritically accept Hollywood's version of history, we risk repeating its omissions. The cross wasn't just a tool of terror, it was a ledger tallying whose pain mattered and whose didn't. And in that uncomfortable truth lies a challenge: to see past the spectacle to the systems beneath, then ask who they're designed to protect and who they're not. The answer might reveal more about our own world than we'd like to admit. the echoes of Rome's selective brutality reverberate in ways that might feel uncomfortably familiar today. Consider how modern nations wield power-drone strikes targeting foreign militants while citizens accused of similar crimes face trial, or the stark disparities in capital punishment where nationality often dictates who receives due process and who doesn't. These aren't direct parallels to crucifixion, of course, but they share an unsettling common thread: the idea that some lives are shielded by legal privilege while others are exposed to the full force of state violence. Rome's distinction between citizen and outsider wasn't just about justice. It was about maintaining a hierarchy where certain people were inherently worth protecting and others weren't. Fast forward 2,000 years, and the same ethical quandaries persist: who deserves mercy and who becomes an example. Take the case of extrajudicial drone strikes, where governments argue that threats abroad require swift, unilateral action, actions that would never be tolerated against their own citizens on home soil. The rationale echoes Rome's logic. Outsiders exist in a different legal and moral universe where protections are negotiable. Or examine the death penalty in some nations where foreign nationals often lack access to the same legal resources as citizens, leading to disproportionate executions. These modern divides mirror Rome's unspoken rule: the value of a life depends on paperwork, not humanity. Yet the most telling parallel lies in the public's reaction, or lack thereof. Just as Roman crowds might protest a citizen's crucifixion while ignoring thousands of slave executions, modern societies often overlook injustices that don't directly threaten their own status. Prisons filled with marginalized groups, border policies that dehumanize refugees, even algorithmic biases in policing, all reflect the same ancient calculus of who counts and who doesn't. Rome's legacy isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a cautionary tale about how easily systems of privilege can justify cruelty, so long as the suffering stays out of sight for the right people. What's chilling is how these distinctions persist even in societies that pride themselves on equality. The same democracies that condemn Rome's brutality replicate its patterns, reserving the harshest punishments for those on the margins while offering citizens layers of appeals and protections. This isn't to equate modern justice with crucifixion, but to highlight a recurring theme. The line between civilization and barbarism often depends on who's drawing it and who's being erased by it. Rome's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. When does security become hypocrisy? How do we reconcile the rights we demand for ourselves with those we deny others? The empire's downfall came not when it was at its most brutal, but when its contradictions became impossible to ignore. As we navigate our own era's tensions between safety and fairness, between us and them, the lesson isn't just about avoiding Rome's mistakes. It's about recognizing how easily we repeat them, often without realizing the line we're crossing until it's too late. The cross may have vanished from our legal systems, but the logic that once filled them lingers, waiting for us to see it for what it is. Rome's refusal to crucify its own citizens wasn't just a legal technicality. It was a window into the empire's soul. Beneath the gilded statues and marble forums, this one restraint revealed a society deeply invested in the illusion of its own civility. The law protected citizens from the cross not out of compassion, but because their degradation would undermine the very hierarchy that kept Rome stable. Slaves and rebels could be broken publicly, their suffering a spectacle to deter others, but citizens, their punishments had to preserve the myth that loyalty came with dignity, even in disgrace. This wasn't justice, it was crowd control, a way to make inequality feel inevitable rather than imposed. The psychological calculus was chilling in its precision. By sparing citizens the worst horrors, Rome turned privilege into a form of compliance. If you played by the rules, the state's brutality was something that happened to other people, a threat that loomed just close enough to keep you in line, but never so close that you'd question the system itself. The cross wasn't avoided because Rome valued life. It was avoided because Rome valued order, and order relied on the belief that some lives were worth more than others. This duality, savagery for outsiders, restraint for insiders, wasn't a flaw in the empire's logic. It was the logic itself. 2,000 years later, the questions Rome grappled with still haunt us. Who is deemed worthy of protection in our own societies? Whose suffering is seen as tragic and whose is dismissed as inevitable? The Roman philosopher Seneca, no stranger to tyranny, once wrote, "Wherever there is a human being, there is an opportunity for kindness." Yet his own society built an empire on the opposite premise, that kindness, like justice, was a privilege, not a right. Rome's legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The line between civilization and barbarism isn't drawn by laws, but by who those laws are designed to shield. So was Rome's system enlightened or oppressive? The answer lies in the space between its ideals and its actions. An empire that could ban crucifixion for citizens while nailing thousands to crosses elsewhere wasn't just hypocritical, it was revealing. It showed how easily societies can justify cruelty so long as it's directed at the right people. And that's the challenge history leaves us with, not just to recognize these patterns, but to ask where they repeat today. What do you think? Did Rome's restraint make it more just or simply more calculating? Share your thoughts below, and let's keep the conversation going. After all, the past isn't just a story, it's a mirror.